for that reason. If you get 191, can you imagine 191 with that much?
It's already a mess. It's already
jobs. It's
I don't
crazy.
ever drive on 26 if there's an option like that.
Yeah, well, see, if they didn't do that exchange, though, 191, that there's the Arboretum.
Got here for you this morning is kind of just an analysis of our finances as far as general fund, water fund, what we look like on debt capacity, debt affordability, that sort of stuff. So he's going to go through that, and if y'all got questions as we go through, I'm sure he's fine for you to stop.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to keep it as conversational as possible. Y'all all right if I take my mask off while we do this? Okay, great. So good morning again. My name's Ted Cole. Each of you has a hard copy of this, and it's exactly what's on the screen. And as Josh said, this is really just informational. I had met with Josh and Tammy back in early December. We had some mutual acquaintances in local government. We do work in North Carolina, quite a bit of work with local governments on what we call financial advisory services. And I'll talk a little more about that. So we had some common acquaintances and just connected, and we talked a little bit about what we do, put some information together specific to y'all, and I think thought it was worth sharing with you all. And so don't know exactly where we go from here, but this is a great opportunity selfishly for us to present some material to y'all. I think will be helpful to you, and maybe we have an opportunity to work together in the future, right? So that's really where we're coming at it from. So there are page numbers in the bottom right corner. There's sort of a table of contents on page 1. And again, please stop me as we go. I'll give you a little bit of an overview about our group, our public finance group, and then we'll go through a series of discussion items about credit ratings. We drill down into your general fund operations and fund balance, talk a little bit about that, your tax supported debt profile. So that's basically everything except utilities. And then we talk about water, sewer related debt. And then we finish up with just a very general discussion about capital improvement planning. I know you all obviously are getting ready to go into the budget. You have a CIP. I think Josh had shared with me there's a desire to maybe revisit that, which you probably do every year in terms of adding a year and dropping a year, prioritization. So maybe this gives you a little bit of a running start at that. So with that, a little bit about Davenport on page 3. Again, the bottom right, somebody else is moving that. Thank you. Bottom right corner page numbers. We are an employee-owned firm. We're a financial services firm. We're what we call a broker-dealer in the world of finance. We are very much Mid-Atlantic focused. And within Davenport, we have a group that we call public finance or municipal finance. They're kind of interchangeable. And essentially what that means is we work with local governments in a financial advisory capacity. And that means capital planning, assistance with debt and financings, refinancing of debt, elements of budgeting, investments, really just a wide range of services that we provide, both analytical but also transactional. And our clients are generally cities, counties, towns, authorities. And you'll see a little more about specifically to North Carolina here in a moment. Page 4 just gives you a high-level overview of our experience within our footprint. And on the left, we just talk about the type of transactions that we assist with. And this is roughly a 10-year look back. And then the volume that may or may not resonate or mean anything to you all. But we've got about 30 people in our group, and we're pretty active in that world. Page 5 is just a wide range of the types of services we provide. So, no two engagements are exactly the same. The left-hand side is more planning and analytical. We get into general fund capital planning, utility planning. As we said, a lot of it is surrounding the concept of debt capacity, debt affordability. As I said, investments, credit ratings, bond ratings when applicable. And then certainly when clients need to go out and borrow money for whatever the purpose might be, we're often involved. So it's sort of a wide range of services. 6 just gives you an idea of clients served within North Carolina. Most of these are active clients. Not that everybody does something every year, but they are ongoing engagements. And you can see it's a pretty wide range, as I said, small, large, urban, rural, what have you.
Ted, when's the last time you worked with Buncombe County?
We work with Buncombe County every year. We're in the midst of doing something this spring and summer for some school financings and some refunding of old debt. So they're fairly active. And so we usually have an opportunity to work with them annually at least. Okay. Page 7 gives you a little more detail of engagements specifically around utilities, right? So, a lot of our clients don't necessarily have utility systems. They might be part of a regional system or they just don't have it. So we wanted to break out the utility experience as well, because you all do have utilities under your control. All right, so that's the firm. That's what we do. If there aren't any questions, then we'll kind of jump into the meat of the presentation. And we're going to start with credit ratings on page 9. The town is not rated. You've never needed a rating. That certainly does not mean you're not credit worthy. There are lots of North Carolina localities that don't have ratings. But in this presentation, we're going to do some comparisons to Black Mountain relative to rated cities and towns. We're not looking at counties because there's a pretty different dynamic financially. But you're going to see some comparisons about fund balance and debt. And we're going to compare Black Mountain to AAA rated cities and towns. That's the highest credit rating any local government can achieve. AA and single A. And we have the ability, because we subscribe to a database that one of the rating agencies, Moody's, maintains. Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch are the 3 national rating agencies. And while we'll talk a lot about the rating agencies, I don't want to leave you with the thought that you need a rating. You only need a rating if a project comes along that you need to go to the bond market to access capital. And that usually means generally larger projects or longer term paybacks. And if you determine that the bond market is the best way to borrow the money, then you need a rating. But bank financing, state programs, SRF funding, things like that, you don't need a rating. There's no reason to go get a rating just to have one. But if we determine, or you determine, that there is a project out there and you want to go a certain way to the bond market, then that would be applicable.
What's SRF?
State revolving fund. So it's usually low interest loans for utilities.
To get a rating, that's something affirmative that the town has to apply for, pay for.
That's correct. Yes. You would, if whatever the reason came about that you said, look, we want to get 1 or more ratings, you would approach the 1, 2, or 3 rating agency. We want a rating. You pay for it. You go through a process and they publish a rating. And once you have a rating, they will want to talk to you on an annual basis. They look at audits, they look at budgets, because they want to make sure that whatever rating they've assigned is, it's relevant as times change and things move forward. So we have the ability to pull cities and towns nationally. So if you look at the right-hand side, across the country, cities and towns, not counties, there are 230 AAA cities and towns, 1,300 AA's, and almost 600 single A's. Maybe a little more relevant in North Carolina, AAA cities and towns by Moody's, there's 13 of them, right? So you can see who they are. AA, there's 25 cities and towns that are rated AA and 2 that are rated single A. And, as we go through this, you'll start to get a sense of, maybe where do we line up roughly? Okay. Page 10 just gives you a little bit of an overview about how those rating agencies go about rating local governments. And the upper left is Moody's. Both Moody's and S&P, which are the two more commonly used, have gone to a much more transparent, quantitative, data-driven process, because they came under a lot of scrutiny in the 08-09 period when we had the financial crisis and inconsistencies and lack of transparency. So they have worked really hard since that time to inject some transparency into their process. So you'll see with Moody's, for local governments, economy and tax base is worth 30% of the rating. That's like your total assessed value, your certain demographics, wealth levels, median family income, assessed value per capita, things of that nature. And we put check boxes. What do you all as an elected body have short-term control over and or long-term control over? I mean, moving the needle on your assessed value is not something you do every year with a budget. It is a longer-term play to create an environment where people want to come and invest and grow. It's a long-term endeavor. Finances is 30% of the rating, and that is something where you have some short-term control by making decisions about spending and budgeting, setting aside reserves, and it's also a long-term endeavor. Management, we're getting into things like policies, procedures, budgeting practices, reporting, things of that nature. A little more subjective, but they try to quantify strengths and weaknesses there. That's about 20% of the rating. And then debt and pension obligations is 20% of the rating. North Carolina scores out really well on pensions. It's a well-funded pension relative to what you have in other states. So y'all don't necessarily control the pension side of things, but the good news is you score well because you're in North Carolina. Debt is roughly half of that. So it's only about 10% of the rating. People think a lot about ratings and credit, that debt must play a really big role in it. And it's certainly important, but it's not the driver. I'm not going to go through the S&P. They pretty much get to the same place. All right, so now we're going to dig into general fund operations. And what this page 12 has, that if you care to, you can go back to your annual audits and kind of tie back to all of these numbers. This is the general fund, not utilities. We've got audited financials here, 17 through 20, and the 2021 data is a draft. I think it's a pretty good draft, but it's not officially, I guess, out there as a final. And you can see this is helpful to us and maybe helpful to you. Revenues are across the top 10 lines. So you can kind of get a sense in total and by major department how revenues have evolved over this 5-year period. We've got expenditures in the middle down to line 22. So same thing, see how they've evolved. Line 24 is just measuring operationally revenues over or under expenditures. Are we running an operating surplus or deficit on line 24? And you'll see over the last 5 years, all but 1 year, you've been running surpluses. And it may well be that there's some capital in some of those expenditures that is creating that deficit in 2018. Not that you are structurally imbalanced on operating costs, but you probably have some capital embedded in there along the way. The bottom of this page is tracking other transfers in and out of the general fund that are reported in your audit. There is on line 32 a change in fund balance. That is, are we adding or subtracting from fund balance in any given year? And you'll see over the last 3 years, You've been adding to fund balance each year, and we're tracking total fund balance at the very bottom. So over this 5-year period, total fund balance in the general fund has evolved from about 4.5 million up to 6.2 million. Okay.
What is maybe for Tammy or Josh, remind me what's in, you got sales taxes in number 7 and on the revenue list. What's other taxes, number 2?
Motor vehicle, maybe?
Yeah, it would be motor vehicle.
Well, other taxes in your sales, that's your sales and use tax. 7 is sales and services.
That permits and so forth?
Yeah,
So that's permits and so forth in number 7,
yeah.
and that's sales taxes in number 3. I said 2, but 3.
Mhm.
Okay, that's
Okay.
okay. Thank you.
All right, great. Page 13, this is something that we talked about more recently with Josh and Tammy, and this was a sort of an exercise to go through to calculate what we call debt service coverage. The premise behind this is, once you pay your operating expenses, salaries, utilities, things of that nature, what do you have left over to pay your debt? And how many times could you cover your debt? And so what I'd suggest we do is for 2020, column C, let's go down column C because I think it's a simpler presentation. There's no exact one way to do this, but I think it's a reasonable way to do it between C and D. You've got revenues of 9 million. I'm going to round off 9 million. You've got expenditures of 8.7 million. And then we want to back out debt service. We want to isolate debt service because what we're trying to identify is after we pay everything else, how much money do we have left over to cover our debt payment? And so what that ends up leaving you is line 9, net revenue available for debt service, 666,000. Your debt service was 382,000 on line 16. So the simple math is you covered your debt 1.7 times over. For every dollar of debt service you had to pay, you had $1.74 available to pay it, which is good, right? Higher is better. It means you've got cushion there to make payments if something on revenues or expenditures were to change. Embedded in that calculation in your expenditures is some capital outlay. That's why we ran column D. The idea being that you would probably pay your debt service before you would invest in new capital. If you were in a really bad situation, right, you wouldn't be going out and doing new capital before you paid debt on existing obligations. So we made an adjustment for that. And so what it ended up doing is saying on line 9, you've actually got about $1.3 million to pay your debt service of 382,000, excluding the capital. So you actually were covering your debt almost 3.5 times before capital. So it's two ways to look at it. I said there's no absolute way to look at it, but between C and D, I think you can kind of get a sense that you all are in very good shape on the general fund. You are structurally balanced and you have ample ability to cover the debt that is on the books today.
The difference in the 1.7 and the 3.4 is it one way you're looking at it and you're saying what's our debt, excuse me, what's our debt coverage? And you after we pay our existing debt service, what's our debt service ratio? In column D, you're saying don't consider the current debt. Add it back. Now what's your debt coverage? That's what you're doing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean
So it's a little.
The real difference between C and D is line 9, and you'll see in D it's a bigger number, right? You have more dollars to pay the same debt service, and that's because what we did is we said we want to calculate this before you make a capital payment on new capital, whatever that may be, because the idea would be it would be what we call below the line. You would do that after you pay your debt service. Again, in a really bad financial time, you would make sure your payment of the 382,000 is made before you make that 650,000 on line 6 investment in new capital. So it's just two ways to look at it. one is a little more conservative, column C, but it's still really solid at 1.7 times.
This might be a question for Josh. What's an example of new capital that would have fallen into that 6,500,000?
I'm sure he's pulling that from our CIP, right?
And it would be, I don't know, maybe that's where you've got some vehicles or you've got some other
Vehicles,
maintenance type.
Truck, some kind of water line, well, not water line, but maybe a park project, something that's in our CIP.
Maintenance on facilities that you might have booked. I mean, that part of it is what the auditors determine is a capital expense versus an operating expense.
Capital expenses are things that are over $5,000 and have a loss of more than a year.
That you're planning on.
So a roof repair, it's just, it's not the year in and year out operating cost.
Okay.
It's probably a little bit of
A good bit of it, and if you look at the CIP, is things, they're big projects where the town had decided, I mean, it's always been in the CIP, it just kind of rolls forward every 5 years, It might be putting a couple $100,000 down toward a new fire truck that you're gonna buy 5 years out or something, that costs a ton of money, there's stuff like that. But a
Yeah.
lot of that, there's, it's a funding a big expenditure that's 3 or 4 years out, and being a good bit of it's that way, isn't it?
I think maybe street paving would be captured in that number, things like that. Okay. 2021 draft, and we don't have all the details yet, but ultimately when it's finalized, we would be able to come back and revisit it. And you did a prepayment of a loan you had. You pay a partial prepayment of a loan you had there under column F, which skews the numbers a little bit. But when we account for that, your coverage there was about 2.3 times. What we have not adjusted for yet is the capital, like we did in column D, because we don't have all schedules of the new audit yet. But once those are available, we'll be able to do the equivalent of column D for FY21. That's why what you're seeing, the numbers are a little lower in E and F than they were in B and C, if you're following what I'm saying. So there are, once we get the new audit, I think we'll be able to break out another column of this that will be equivalent to D. But the point being, when you compare column F and column C, after you account for that partial prepayment of debt, you had very solid coverage. That was a one-time, I don't know whether it was a total payoff. I think it was a partial payoff.
It was partial.
We sold a building for roughly that and applied, it was our old public service building, and we sold it and applied the proceeds to the loan on the new public service building.
Gotcha. Yeah, so a one-time event, and that's why we backed it out in column F.
And I guess the revenue from the sale was in the prior fiscal year.
That's correct.
So it ended up, the fund balance was washed, but not in the same year.
All right, let me go to fund balance on 14. The left-hand side is the drill down on the detail of your fund balance. You'll be able to find it in the audits, and you'll see that with accounting standards, there are different categories of fund balance. Those are what are shown on lines 6 through 11. And those are, different levels of restrictions, different levels of control. The bucket of fund balance that you all have the most control over is line 10, the unassigned fund balance. That's really the piece that has the least restrictions. It's more free and clear for you all, sort of a checking account type. And that's usually what you're paying, expenses in and out of, and it provides you the float through the year. So we're categorizing that, and then we're just doing a series of calculations at the bottom of the table, or you can maybe see it a little bit clearer on the upper right chart. You all do have a policy for fund balance that unassigned component, not the total fund balance, but the unassigned component should be at least 30% of the previous year's actual expenditures and transfers. So that's in that upper right chart, that's the red line. That's your policy floor at 30%. And the fund balance component that is applicable to that is that dark green line, the unassigned. That is what's tracking line 10 on the chart, on the table on the left. So we're just simply doing the math. How does that dollar amount compare to the expenditures? And you have been at or above your policy for all of the last 5 years, which is great. And over this 5-year period, the unassigned fund balance has been growing at a faster clip than the budget, right? That's why that line generally is going up from left to right. Both of those are good stories.
Excuse me, Ted, I think it's worth mentioning to the council, and I chatted with Josh about this the other day, and chime in, Josh or Tammy, but the 2021 draft numbers are really good because things went very well in the town, lots of building, lots of growth. Sales tax was, up phenomenal amount. And on top of that, our budget planning for fiscal year ending June 30, 21, we didn't know what was going to happen because we're in the middle of the pandemic. And so we budgeted very carefully, and the result was good revenue, and we really had a very tight budget. And so that gave us a big pop in the current fiscal year ending 6/30/21.
Yep.
Josh, can I ask a question?
Sure.
The 30%, that is our policy. And is that sort of a best practice? Is that mandated by anywhere, or how do we?
It is not. LGC, Local Government Commission, mandates, is it 5% or 8%? 8%, that we have 8% unassigned. This council, a number of years ago, put in a 30% policy.
Okay.
And I think the whole point of that unassigned fund balance is, we need to be able to operate, right? Because we don't get a lot of our revenue till the end of the year.
Right.
So we got to be able to operate, but it has been, it's almost 45% now, so.
Okay. I didn't know the history of it.
Yeah, and
So
a
I
little
think
little perspective. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Keep in mind when we're showing you these numbers, that's a moment in time, right? June 30, right? As Josh said, revenues and expenditures ebb and flow. And I would say just anecdotally, that's you wouldn't be an outlier on the high end at 30%. That's in a reasonable range. I mean, there may be some places that operate at a higher level, particularly if they're a smaller community, right? Because there's a certain amount of dollars you need just to react.
Right.
And bigger places, bigger budgets, they might be able to operate at a lower percentage.
I think that's the key thing is that, like if you're Buncombe County, and I can't remember the counties, it might be 15%, maybe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a big budget.
That's a lot of 15% is a lot of money.
It's a lot of
That's
money.
right.
It's a $350 million budget or something like that. So
Right.
that's a lot. But for ours, pure dollar wise, if we had an emergency, that's just it's about what you need to have in the bank if you had an emergency.
Right.
And you have a lot of jurisdictions on the coast that carry a big one for
Right.
Yeah.
hurricane issues. They
Right.
carry, maybe 100% or something. I mean, a lot of them carry big ones because emergencies.
Okay.
Yeah, and the FEMA reimbursements are slow at best, and the other thing is it also allows you to react to opportunities, right? I mean,
Right.
maybe there's a land acquisition you want to do, or some other economic development related thing. So it's just, and you look really good. So the takeaway here is you have a good policy, you're in compliance, and over this 5-year period, as a percent of your budget, you've been improving. And going back to how the rating agencies do their things, finances was 30%. It's really two things. Where are your reserve levels today, and what has the 5-year trend been? And that sets up pretty nicely for what you've done.
And what's the light green line?
Good question. Let's see. Light green is just measuring line 11. That's your total fund balance. So it grabs those other categories besides unassigned. And then the rating agencies on line 13 do something called available. It's the brown line. The brown and the green for you are very close. The reason they do that is they know that not every local government lets all the quote unquote extra fall to unassigned, that they might commit or assign dollars to sort of different categories for whatever reason. So it's not fair necessarily to just look at unassigned across every local government, because again, one place might let all the extra go to unassigned, whereas somebody else allocates it. And so that's why the rating agencies do a little bit of a broader grab of those buckets. And I think they basically grab everything except the non-spendable things that you all as an elected body can control. Okay? All right, this next page is very busy, and I'm going to just focus on the right-hand side of the page. This is where we pull in the comparatives from that Moody's database I talked about. And if you look at the upper right chart, this is the unassigned component of your fund balance, not the available, not the total, just the unassigned, which again in FY21 is about 4.3 million. And that upper right chart is measuring dollars. So you're in that gold bar. That's your $4.3 million. The light green bars are the national cities and towns that are rated AAA, AA, single A. And the dark green are the North Carolina cities and towns that are rated AAA, AA, single A. And what these bars represent is the median for each group, the midpoint. So when you look at the North Carolina AA, it's the second from the bottom in that top chart. The median to me looks to be, around $12 million. If you see that, the second from the bottom, that's the midpoint of about 25 different local governments. The blue line shows you the min and the max within that group, right? So somebody in that AA category is 15 million and somebody's up around 40 million, right? But the median looks to be right around 12 million, okay? So you're a little below the median on dollars. And you can see with the AAAs, you got somebody that's 115 million, right? Big place, Charlotte, Winston, Raleigh, whatever it might be, Greensboro. What a little more relevant is the chart directly below it, which we move away from dollars and we say, what is that fund balance as a percent of our budget? So it's it's a better comparison, right? Because it accounts for big places and smaller places. So you're at, as we said on the prior page, for the unassigned, your policy is 30, but you're actually around 45%. So that gold bar now in the very bottom right chart is 45. And you can see you compare very well to all of the universe of local governments out there, the medians. You're above the North Carolina medians with an unassigned fund balance of 45%. And the same is basically true as you look at the middle of the page or the left of the page. It's just the available fund balance or the total fund balance. The takeaway is the same. You're a smaller community, so your dollars aren't quite as big across the top, but as a percent of your budget, you compare very well.
Yeah, it's sort of the takeaway is we're healthy, but the numbers are small.
That's right. That's right. And you'll notice when you go back and look at the local governments that are AAA and AA rated, you got Chapel Hill and Charlotte are both AAA. One's a lot bigger than the other, but this is a way to compare them on one financial metric.
Looking at the min and the max of the total dollar amount.
Yep.
Is this kind of suggesting that there maybe is no small town or town the size of us that has a AA or a AAA rating?
Let's see.
Considering how healthy we are on percentage wise, but
And remember, Burlington, Carrboro, Clayton. Those are some smaller places that might have actual dollars that are going to be bigger than you all. I think you're right, because you look at the range for AA and AAA, and you're talking about the dollars, right?
Right,
The upper right. Yeah. So you'd be a little bit lower than the median. You would be on the low end or the lowest of that group, but it's also not the only input in the rating category. So you might be on the low end, but you've got you're stronger in certain other areas that can compensate for it. But I think that's a fair takeaway. Of those 25 to 40 different AAA and AA North Carolina cities and towns, you would be on the lower end in terms of absolute dollars, but there's 400 or 500 some places that aren't rated. So it's a small universe. Okay. What I would tell you, just from an outsider's perspective, before we get into debt, is again, you're not rated. You don't need to be rated. You may never need to be rated, depending on what you want to do with your capital plan and how you want to fund it, because there's a lot of good funding sources that don't require rating. But I think at least the way that you've managed yourselves on budgeting and fund balance, you would set yourself up nicely to go through the rating process. And keep in mind, banks are going to do a lot of the same thing, right? I mean, the rating agency discussion we're having is really kind of a proxy for any bank that's going to sit here and say, well, let's really look at what Black Mountain looks like financially. They're going to put your audits out and they're going to do their work, and they're going to come to a lot of the same conclusion. It might not be published the way that the rating agencies do it, but it's going to get to the same place often. Okay. All right. So then we go into debt. Page 17, this is tax supported debt, and you don't need to flip back there, but if you want to see the total tax supported debt outstanding, I'm going to round up, it's just under $2 million. And you can see that those are made up of what we call a lot of acronyms, IPCs, LOBs, and COPs. Those are all loans that you have from banks that are secured by an asset, a truck, a building, a fire truck, whatever. They're called installment purchase contracts, limited obligation bonds, or certificates of participation. They're all the same. It's not a GO bond, which a GO bond is where you go to the voters, they approve a bond, and what you give the bank or the bondholder is your taxing authority, your full faith and credit. Rather than doing that, and this is very common, you do these loans that are secured by whatever it is you're buying or improving. So $2 million of debt outstanding, that is made up, just for perspective, that's made up of about 5 different loans. And if you care to get into it, you can look in Appendix A and see each of the 5 loans that make that profile up. That's not one loan. And you can see by fiscal year, graphically or on the table on the right, what your payments are. Fiscal 22, the year we're in, roughly $340,000. And then it's going to be stepping down over time. Not a lot of step down in the next few years, but you've got some significant step downs out into 28 and 29. Okay. Everything you have is fixed rate, fixed payments. So nothing's going to change unless you all were to go about paying it off or refunding it for savings. The far right column on this chart is a debt ratio, and what it it's called the 10-year payout. What it measures is how quickly are you paying your debt back. It's a forward look, 10 years. And so what this tells us is basically 10 years from now, all of this debt will have been paid back. Higher is better. It means you're paying debt back more quickly. You're not backloading it or extending it. So you've got a very, not a large amount of debt by any means, tax supported, not utility, tax supported, and it pays off quickly. Okay. A couple other debt ratios. Page 18, the left-hand side is graphing that payout ratio. This is a pretty important debt ratio. So again, it's measuring how fast you're paying back your debt. And we know for y'all, the forward 10-year look, 10 years from now, 98% of the debt that's on the books today will have been repaid. When you look at the comparison on the right, you're in gold. You want your bar further to the right, and you can see you're at or above the medians in the range for that, right? So, you are in very good shape there. You'll also notice that the AAA and AA, you have folks out there that have payout ratios down in the 50% range. I will tell you, the minute you consider doing a 20-year bond, if you ever did, that bond by itself would have a 50% payback. So if you're paying back a bond over 20 years, that automatically has a 50% payout. So you are very strong in this regard, but it's also a function of when you've used debt, you've usually kept it to probably a 10 or maybe a 15-year term. Okay. This is something you might want to consider as you get into the capital planning discussion. If you want to entertain a component of debt funding for things, maybe there's a policy that you could put in place that would help sort of manage some of your debt decisions. And a policy would usually say, we don't want to fall below X, 50%, 60%, whatever it might be. All right, next page is debt to assessed value. So this is just a ratio it looks at. Remember, there's roughly $2 million of debt outstanding. As a percent of your tax base, which is 1.5 billion, we do the math. Your debt to assessed value ratio is 0.13%. Very low, right? And you can see that in the upper right corner chart. You're at 0.13%. These rated communities, particularly the higher rated communities in North Carolina, they're up in the range of 0.5% to even 1.5%. And that's usually associated with highly rated communities or high growth communities, often lots of needs, desires, wants, and usually they tend to have higher debt ratios. But remember, the debt part of this is 10, 20%, right? So that's not going to drive the rating. Economy and finances represent 60% of the rating. So at any rate, you're in very good shape. And when we look at this in a vacuum, what I would say is Black Mountain has debt capacity. And what I mean by that is you could take on debt for whatever the reason would be, not unlimited, but some amount, and still compare well to highly rated communities. Now, that doesn't mean you should do debt. It doesn't mean it's affordable, right? Because there's debt capacity and debt affordability. And we're going to talk about affordability in a moment. Capacity is on paper here. You have a relatively low level of debt and low leverage. You could take on debt and still compare in a very reasonable range to, I'll call it your North Carolina rated peers. And you'll see with Moody's, they consider you very strong as long as you're below 0.75%. You're well below it at 0.13. So you have some room to take on debt, again, if you need to and y'all decide you want to, and still be in that strong category, okay? And I just don't want to have the message be that you should go out and issue debt. That is not what we're saying by any means, but you have the capacity. I think the other real important question is, do you have the affordability? If you were to do it, how does it impact your budget? Where's the revenue coming from? What fiscal year is it going to come from? That kind of thing. And lastly, last one is debt service to expenditure. So on all of that debt you have in the general fund, tax supported debt, your annual payment's around $340,000. All this is measuring is what percent of your budget does that debt payment represent? And it's roughly 4%. And you can see, again, on the comparison, not surprising, you're on the lower end. Lower is better. It means, less of your budget is tied up in a fixed debt payment, gives you a little more flexibility. But you can also see some of these highly rated communities are in the 15, 20. There's an outlier there at 45%. And again, I think it goes back to a lot of those highly rated communities are high growth communities and often have high levels of debt. So like the prior page, when you look at this in a vacuum, y'all have debt capacity. You have the ability to take on debt and still be able to demonstrate you've got a strong debt profile. And then we try to address, this is not final, it's just a starting point, but the affordability discussion, right? I mean, if you wanted to, when you're assessing your capital needs, I'm sure you're looking at how much money do we have in our operating budget that we could apply to capital? How much fund balance might we want to appropriate for capital? And maybe debt plays a role as well, right? Those are kind of, and these days you've also got ARPA and other, other sources of funding, probably more sources of funding today than most years. But generally the ones you control is there money in our operating budget to fund capital? Do we have reserves that we would be comfortable using for capital, or do we need to consider debt? What this is set up to do is to try to help discuss the affordability. So if you look at the left-hand side, everything is on a fiscal year basis. Column B is the payments you have on your existing debt, right? So we know what you owe on your existing loans. Column C, D, and E are placeholders for CIP, capital planning scenarios, right? So as things evolve with your budget and with your capital plan, and you're looking at prioritizing by year, and you say, all right, well, how much of this do we think we could afford to pay cash for? Is there a gap that maybe we want to think about debt? That's where we could layer in some scenarios and start to measure affordability. So columns B through F are just existing and potential new capital funding, debt or PAYGO. Some capital projects have an operating impact that come with them. Column E, you might say, look, we're going to open, just hypothetically, we're going to open a rec center. And yes, there's a capital cost associated with that, but there's probably a new operating cost. So we want to be able to capture that where applicable. So that's F, sums all of that up. G is what I believe we backed into this accurately. Don't hold me to it. It's more of a concept than the actual working model. But what you budgeted for debt service in FY22, I think it was around $494,000 out of the general fund. And we can sort of catch up on that. But when you look at column G, there was 494 budgeted. The payment was about 340, right? So that's what column J is measuring. We're just looking at revenues available versus the payments made. Revenues available is column I, and we've held it flat, right? That 494. We've assumed right now that you could continue to appropriate that much every year. Not that you will, but you could, right? Because as your debt payments start to step down, if you continue to appropriate the same amount of money each year, you're going to be capturing some dollars for capital funding in the future. Now, you'll be at a decision point when you do your budget. If you have a step down in your annual debt payment, you might say, well, I want that money somewhere else in the budget. That'll be a budget discussion. But what we've assumed is if you budgeted $494,000 in 22, we've assumed that you can budget that every year going forward. And if you were to do that, column J are some surpluses that could be used to help afford new capital. So it's a starting point for a discussion. Don't put too much stake in the actual numbers, although I think they're reasonably good for the interpreting the budget, but it's really more about a concept of starting to develop, as you're putting your CIP together, developing a funding plan and understanding the affordability. Because what this page will ultimately tell you is if you do too much on the left and you're not finding new revenues in the middle, it's going to show you, hey, there's a shortfall. And maybe it's fiscal year 24. If we do all of this, we're going to have to perhaps make a budget decision about bringing more money into this budget model to help afford whatever it is you might have done.
So the column G, that baseline budget,
Right.
That's that $500,000, let's call it $500,000.
Right.
That's currently what we budget for debt servicing, which is principal and interest.
That's right. I believe that's what was in the 22 budget.
22 budget. That's what our current budget's $500,000 for debt. So we're just saying, make that consistent.
You got it.
You don't borrow any more debt. If you don't have any more debt, then what does it look like? How much surplus do you have at the end?
Exactly. That's what Jay is telling you.
Yeah.
And then, as you can imagine, if we start to drop in scenarios in C, D, and E, we figure out how far Jay will take you
Right.
to afford something new.
Right.
So it's getting back to that second concept. There's the capacity, and then there's the affordability.
Right. And then another way to look at it is if you got this $500,000 debt service and you don't borrow any more money, that'd be a great thing. I mean, something will come up. You're probably going to have to. Let's just say you don't. The other thing is in your capital budgeting, you start doing what we've done over the past years, and you put $250,000 toward that project and $250,000 toward this one, and you've got, you can borrow less money that way.
That's right.
Because you're funding it yourself.
You could start, setting up project ordinances or whatever the right term is and squirreling money away. And so, in a few years, maybe you, as you said, you could cash fund the project versus debt fund it.
Which would be your line O, right? Column O over here, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, thank you. All of that right now is all the annual surpluses in J are just accumulating in O right now. Okay? So that's a starting point. That's the general fund side. I know we're closing in on an hour. We're almost done here. I did want to talk about utilities. The debt profile on utilities is not all that different. I'm going to round up slightly, about 1.4 million of debt outstanding, goes out to 2032. Most of not most, about half of it are those IPCs, those bank loans secured by an asset. And you have some state revolving fund loans, which are low interest loans that the state makes available through an application process for utilities. And everything's paid off in 2032. The payout ratio, like on the general fund side, is very solid. This debt profile for water is made up of 4 loans. And you can see that if you want to in Appendix B, the detail. Okay. Page 24 is what we call a cash flow model for utilities. We have not updated it for 2021 yet, but if you look at 2020, this is kind of getting to what I talked about earlier about in the general fund about cash flow and available to cover how many dollars you have available to make your debt payments. So if you go down 2020, and all of these line items are numbered, your revenues in that fund were $1.5 million. You can see what they were over the 4-year period. Your operating expenditures were a little over $900,000. And so what that meant on line 3 is your revenue available for debt service was $620,000. That's just simple math. $1.5 million minus 900, $621,000. Your debt payment was about $250,000. So drop down to line 21, that same debt coverage concept, you covered your debt there by 2.5 times. For every dollar of debt service you had to pay, you had $2.48 available to pay it. Really strong, right? That gives you that cushion. If revenues take a turn down or there's an unexpected expenditure, you can still you have a lot of cushion to make your payments. It also demonstrates that you are running surpluses. You have dollars that you can reinvest in the system for capital. And you're doing that. Line 11, you can see there's capital going into that system every year. There's also a CIP that you have that, you'll revisit and prioritize. And like the general fund, maybe there may be an effort to say, look, what can we really do over a 3 or a 5-year period? The idea would be is start to think about projecting what revenues and expenditures look like in this fund over a 3 or 5-year period, and taking the CIP and seeing how can we fund all the projects that are on this list.
So I'm sort of curious, Josh, and wait, this isn't the 21 numbers.
Nope.
So
It's 20.
The 21 numbers reflect the new tap fees. I can't think of what we actually call it.
System development fees.
System development fees, that we adjusted and had to, but the way the law works. And so there's, the water fund, it's about $1 million, isn't it, Josh? Didn't you tell me?
Yeah.
Development fees will be in a separate fund.
It will be, but it's about.
It's in the water fund, isn't it?
It's its own separate fund, but we move that into the water fund to do projects with.
Yeah, eventually it's used
That's
for water.
That's correct.
I mean, that's what it is, isn't it? For
Yeah,
somebody
you have
comes,
to-
somebody moves into town or they're building a house, and it says, you buy a piece of our water system. That's
That's
what we're
correct.
trying to do.
That's right.
So that kind of plays into the
Yeah.
water fund in a big way.
Absolutely. And we're tracking, in utility speak, we don't usually call it fund balance on line 18. We call it unrestricted cash. I think in layman's terms, what I like to use, it's kind of a proxy. That's our fund balance in that fund. And you can see how that has tracked over the years there on line 18. And, in 2020, you had unrestricted cash that was just about equal to your operating expenditure. So you had on lines 22 and 23, your unrestricted cash as a percent of your operating expenses was 90%. Pretty solid, right? So if revenues completely turn off, you could pay almost a year of expenses with the cash that you have. That is good practice, and you're not an outlier. I don't want to leave you thinking we've got way too much cash in that fund. As you can imagine, $800,000 only goes so far if there's a pump station that, whatever it may be, a line break, this, that, or the other thing. Also, often with utility projects, there's right-of-ways and other things you've got to do before you're ready to fund that project. So having some cash to move those projects along, those incremental costs is a big value, because the local government commission will not let you borrow for a project until it's bid. And so in utility world, you can have a lot of expenses to get to the bidding process, and you really need to be able to cash flow those. So you have good coverage in this fund, and you have good cash. So not, very similar to our conversation on the general fund, there's capacity there. The question becomes, what are our expectations about how revenues and expenditures will grow, and what is the order of magnitude of the capital that might need to be done in any given year. Last thing I believe for this section is 25. You'll go down line D. We tie right back to the page before that, coverage of 2.48 times. And the way we look at it is we take that capital out of the operating and we calculate the coverage, and then we assume the capital would be spent. That's why I think column D is a good presentation for your debt coverage in the water fund. And when the 2021 audit gets completed, we'll be able to replicate that same methodology for the water fund.
I understand column D, but I have to put it in other words, I guess, to make sure I understand it. But column D, you're saying you got $2.48 to cover debt.
That's right.
And so if you're trying to budget, but then you'd have to say, well, we've got this much current. You have to cover that.
Right.
Now, how much more do we have left? Which that gets you over to column C, doesn't it? I mean, it's two different ways to look at it.
It's two different ways to look at it. What it's accounting for is that the difference is line 6 is the capital.
Yeah.
And the question, usually with utilities, there's a pecking order of your payments. The first thing you have to pay is your operating expenses, salaries, utilities, chemicals. Then it's debt service. Then it's capital. Capital is more discretionary than paying your current debt obligations. So that's why we often try to strip out the capital in column D, because again, going back to what I said earlier, in an environment or a year where things are really tight, you might say, look, we just can't pay, we can't invest in any capital this year. So that's why, that's really the difference between C and D. Yeah. But either way, you're very solid, whether you consider the 1.7 times or the 2.48 times.
You probably have a chart on this somewhere, but you look at healthy water funds.
Yes.
You'd say this is a healthy water fund.
Absolutely. Financially healthy. Yes.
You just need to have a healthy water fund.
That's right. And the two main ways of measuring financial health in utility systems is that debt coverage, because it's common sense, but 1.0 is the least coverage you would want to have. You owe $1 a debt, you got $1 to pay. That's not really where you want to be. So oftentimes revenue bonds, which is where you're borrowing money and what you're giving the lender is not an asset. You're giving them a lien on your system revenues. The revenue bonds often require legally that you get at least 1.25 times coverage. That's just kind of industry's practice. That's a minimum. So if it's 1.25, because keep in mind, why would you do that? Well, revenues unexpectedly dip or expenses go up. You want a little coverage. So 1.5 is about the minimum from a budgeting perspective that you would want to see. And if you're operating above 1.5, and you are, then you're that much stronger. So it's coverage and cash. Okay. So that's that. And then the last few pages are just a representation or a presentation of y'all's CIP FY 22 through 26. So page 27 is, I think you should be able to go back to your budget or the CIP and see this. This is the general fund by year. You can see the different uses of funds, the total by year at the top, and then the bottom is a general idea of where are the dollars going to come from to pay for those things. And I guess I would ask, maybe not to put you on the spot, Josh, but this is something you'll revisit, and maybe in some of our conversations, the hope is to sort of refine this a little bit more.
That's right.
Yeah.
So yeah, for this upcoming budget, we're hoping to kind of refine this CIP, maybe take some things out that aren't really going to happen,
Right.
or maybe add some things that they need to happen.
But of course, as council remembers, of course, not everybody was on council when we did the last year's budget, but we do that every year. We look at the capital improvement budget. And it's, the current one's in the budget ordinance, if you wanted to look at it. It's detailed, and it's detailed in the budget ordinance, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, a year drops off, a new year comes on, right? And you all are, I guess you're getting all of this from department heads, and then you're weighing in on the prioritization. But this could be the starting point
Right.
for going back to the front of the book and say, okay, well, how do we really achieve this? Maybe because you're only going to adopt or fund the first year of the CIP in your budget, but you'll approve a 5-year CIP. So away from the budget, there may be a process or desire to say, let's try to look out this 5-year period and see, you know, can we really achieve funding what could be $12 million of projects between cash, reserves, maybe debt if you need it. And that's kind of what we had discussed as you all evolve on the annual update of this. That's where some of this could come back and be relevant in helping, you know, present some material and help make some decisions.
Where did you get your 12 million, 5 years at?
Column H, the line 5, the sum of all of those dollars.
5 years worth, yeah.
You got it.
Yeah.
12.7.
Yeah.
And when you look at preliminarily, how's it going to be funded? There's about $8 million from operating. That's pay as you go. Little bit of debt, grants, and I suspect that's where some further fine tuning you'd want to do. I mean, you know, that's a healthy amount of pay as you go funding, which is great. If you can do that, I mean, that is a great way to fund your capital. But oftentimes we see the needs outstrip the ability for annual cash funding. And so I think that's getting a good update of this. Ideally, it's a real list of projects, not so much a wish list. And then starting to figure out, you know, is this affordable, and how many ways of funding do we need to consider?
Yeah, thank you, Ted. I think what we were thinking about, a good next step is to launch into the budget cycle, looking at the CIP and just looking at it first, since we've kind of gotten a little background in this meeting as to how we work through it. And so Josh will work on that, but if that sounds good to everybody, that we'll just move into that with our first budget workshop. Maybe the second one, I don't know.
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
CIP and also the Elevate Black Mountain. There are a huge number of needs in there, very expensive needs to be factored in and considered. If it's ever going to be anything beyond fantasy.
Yeah, and then just skip to 29. I'm not going to go through it, but you'll see there's a similar document for the water fund.
Yeah.
And probably handle both of those at the same time. And
I know, Councilmember Hay needs to leave soon. Do you have any questions before you leave? And you could ask Josh, he can follow up with Ted and so
Yeah,
forth if you have something later.
I was trying to understand, and you may not be able to answer this. On page 21, so we have this is looking at the $500,000 that we have budgeted for debt services.
Right?
If we left that at $500,000 for the next 20 years. I'm trying to put in real terms, just very big ballpark.
Yep.
How much additional debt we could take on that would not exceed that $500,000. And right now, I think we have 2 million roughly in debt.
2 million of debt, and your payment's about $300,000 a year.
So we're looking at another 800,000 roughly or whatever. To
Yeah,
kinda-
I mean, the term of the debt, right,
Sure,
is
yeah.
5, 10, but
Sure, of course,
just
of course.
generally, if you give me a minute, or a couple, I want to make sure I do this right. The way the LGC, the local government, likes to see this.
And then you see down there on the bottom, on 21, the bottom left, your value of 1 penny increase is $153,000 in revenue.
That's right. Each penny on your tax rate generates $153,000. So that, that 150 will cover $1.5 million of debt over 15 years, give or take.
Okay.
So if you would say, look, I want to go borrow $1.5–2 million for something, that column J, that 150, that 178, that 183 a year, that will cover the debt payment on a $1.5 to $2 million borrowing.
Okay.
And I guess another thing to keep in mind with that is that the debt capacity that you have, say we could borrow another $1.5 million and it still fits within our budgeted number there. It's also a safety factor, if you will, because some unknown something $1.5 million isn't that much money for some of the stuff that
You might want to do.
Small town like Black Mountain has to do $1.5 million project
Go for it.
can come up, and so that's sort of like, it's almost like just about enough reserve debt to
Right.
have.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because that's really important. Like, what do we have, quote unquote, naturally right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're saying, hey, we've got about $150,000–200,000 a year budgeted that we're not using for debt, we could afford 2 million, give or take, within that budget. CIP on the general fund is 10 to 12, right? So there's the disconnect of, okay, what else do we need to do to be able, if that 12 million over 5 years is real,
Mhm.
and that's where it is reality, there is likely to need to be some new source or additional funding to support it.
Mhm.
And that's why we try to figure out, not that you would raise taxes, although that will be an option if you went that route, but that's why we try to figure out the value of a penny. Because it's just a good mental benchmark to say, look, 2 pennies, $300,000 a year, 2 pennies, whether they're pennies that you already levy and you repurpose them, or you have 2 new pennies, that'll help you afford $3–4 million of debt. That's very broad benchmark, but $100,000 per million is a reasonable benchmark, meaning $1 million correlates to about $100,000 a year of a payment.
Mhm.
That's not exact, but it's good for what you're trying to back into.
Yeah. Okay.
Anybody else have any questions?
No, I don't.
This is very helpful. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Very helpful.
We really appreciate you coming up.
Good. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And like I said, this was a great opportunity for us, and we'll just work with Josh and Tammy and see where we go.
Excellent. Well,
Thank you.
So where do you live?
I live in Richmond, Virginia.
Virginia.
I live in Virginia. Spent a lot of time in my car, but
Yeah, yeah.
stayed at
I'm gonna-
Hampton Inn the other
I'm gonna
night. Very
adjourn the
nice.
Meeting, and we don't have to rush, but if we're all
Sure,
done, no more
sure,
questions for
sure.
Ted, meeting adjourned. Thank you. So you're heading back?
I am.
You drive
Before the
down?
snow comes up your way.
Before the snow
Yeah, you're
comes.